welcome to week 6. Week 6 is really going to build upon week 5 by now we're going to look at incentives and different types of contracts. Um, Previously, we've been working with decisions based upon the retailer. How much is a person going to order, or what is the optimum manufacturing size? So like EOQ can be used by the manufacturer to determine how much that they should manufacture from optimum size during a certain time to meet a certain constant demand. Okay. Well, in week 5, we dealt with varying demand. We dealt with probabilities. Obviously, you don't always have a constant demand. So when you use, sometimes you'll use probabilities based upon previous demand forecasting to determine the highest potential for manufacturing, for demand, which would be based for ordering and manufacturing good. So now we're going to talk about how contracts are set up. And as you'll notice, traditional contracts are basically set up to favor one party over the other. If the supplier has control over the retailer, like for instance, let's say if Apple, because of they have a high demand product, they have a lot of control over how much product the retailer can take, then they have a lot of power to create a contract that's favorable to them. And vice versa. If you're like a Walmart, where you are a retailer with a lot of power over your suppliers, you can set up contracts that are favorable to you. So we're gonna talk about those contracts, make to stock and make to order. And that's basically what they are. They're contracts that favor one party over the other. And we're also going to talk about incentives, how a company, a party that may have an advantage over another party, how they can write the incentives in a contract to get them to build more stuff, okay, or for the manufacturer to get the supplier to buy more. Like for instance, for example, a supplier will only build as much as they are contractually obligated to build, and which will not cause a decrease in profitability. But sometimes you may want to give them an incentive to have them build more. Maybe you forecast a lot of variability in your demand. You might want to say, hey, look, if you make X more, we will hedge your risk a little bit by doing such and such. And we're going to go through that. And then I'm going to briefly talk about the distributor. The role, this really isn't much in the textbook. They don't go over it that much, but the role of the distributor has really changed in the last 20 years. And I'm just going to quickly go over it. Actually, at a conference in October, I actually got a chance to sit down with the head of, there's a distributor society in Texas where they do all where distributors develop strategies in Texas, and I got to learn a little bit about how their roles are changing, and they're changing considerably. It used to be a distributor had a lot of power because they were the critical link between the supplier and the manufacturer. But with things like VMI, that role has changed. So now the distributor is basically, their role has changed such that they provide a different type of service to both parties. And I'm going to briefly go over that and not into too much detail. So, and oh yeah, I talked to Don earlier. I didn't do anything for week's 5 problem. But what I might do is, if there's enough demand for it on Sunday, I might just have a quick video conference on Sunday and just go over the problem, just in case people may have problems. I didn't dive into a lot of the week 5 problems yet. I dove into a handful, and they all seem to be pretty on course. So I didn't see a critical need, but then my sample size was fairly small. So my experience shows that the later assignments are usually the people who have more problems with it. So I'm gonna start looking in depth into a lot of the week 5 assignments. So if I feel that there's a lot of disconnection, I may just have a Sunday video conference and put something out for that to go over the problem. Like I did last week, just make a sample problem and go from there. And if you guys feel that this is useful, going over a sample problem, now that I'm back home and my life is relatively sane again, I'll create something in the beginning of each of the video conferences to give an example to go over. So you guys, if you guys feel that there's some value in that.
I found Sunday's video conference very helpful for the assignment.
Okay. So then if what I'll do, I'll just plan for now to have a Sunday video conference, and I'll go over it. If no one's able to appear, because I know Sunday is a really bad day for having video conferences, then I'll just record something and post it up there for people to look at.
Okay, perfect.
And yeah.
Yeah, this is Jeff. I could do Sunday as well. So I just want to confirm that the 5.5 assignment is from page 60 under discussion questions, correct?
Correct.
4, 5.
Correct.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, not the case discussion questions. No, correct. I'm pretty sure, because unless it says case discussion questions in the syllabus, do the discussion questions.
Okay.
But I will double check just to make sure, and I'll let you know. Okay, so in week 6 we're going to talk about sequential supply chains, and basically this is a traditional view of a supply chain. It's sequential basically because it basically focuses on one party controlling the entire supply chain. So in a sequential supply chain, basically a buyer places an order based upon what is demanded, based upon the demand forecast. So so the buyer is only going to order what they think they're going to sell. Okay. And this is important because let's say the manufacturer has a break-even point of 1,000 units based upon, fixed costs, variable costs, whatever. If the buyer is only willing to buy 900 units, the manufacturer will never be able to achieve that break-even cost. And what happens, and I see this quite a bit in defense, what happens a lot is if the break-even point is 1,000 units, they actually will try to increase the cost per unit to raise that break-even point, well, to lower the break-even point. So when the buyer places the order based upon their demand forecast, and the supplier isn't able to make a profit, it causes the supplier to behave differently. So and it's a sequential supply chain also. The supplier is only going to build units based upon what is ordered. Because what happens is and this is fairly obvious, if in this example, the buyer orders 900, but they make 1,000, they assume a risk that the buyer is not going to buy those extra 100 units. So the supplier is going to only build what is ordered, and the buyer's going to buy what's in the demand forecast. So what happens is you have a suboptimization of the entire supply chain. And in worst case scenarios, there's a systems term for it, basically there's a shifted burden occurs where the risk is by both parties a shift on the other party, so therefore you start to have a minimization of the supply chain's effectiveness. So, and this occurs because each party wants to minimize their own risk. And in a case where, let's say the buyer goes, well, I may have a potential high demand due to seasonality or whatever other things that may happen, and I need the supplier to build more units, but the supplier is like saying, well, I'm not going to build them unless you buy them outright. The buyer is incentivized to create some kind of incentive for the supplier to build more units. And there are incentives that can be used by the buyer and the supplier to shift the risk. Well, not to shift the risk, but to share the burden of the risk, and that's what the incentives are for. So let's talk about the two types of contracts that we deal with. So make-to-order contracts, very simple. The supplier does not build units until an order is received. Okay. So, and the buyer, at the time of the order, the buyer pays for all the units are ordered. And at the same time, the buyer assumes all the risk from unsold units. And this is a very standard contract. So in this scenario, the buyer is incentivized to order as few units as possible because they have all the burden. Okay. So, and the supplier's profitability is limited due to overstocking. So in a make-to-order contract, the supplier is like, hey, I'm only going to make to your order. And the buyer is like, well, if you're only going to make to my order, I'm only going to order what I can sell. So if the supplier, let's say that the supplier in the previous example that I said, where the break-even point is 1,000, but the demand is 900, there's an overstocking situation where they may make more than is actually demanded. Or sometimes this is also very frequently what happens. The lead time for the manufacturer may be wider than the demand forecast, in which case they have to guess how many units the buyer is going to pay for. And when you're in this type of scenario, there's a very good possibility of overstocking or understocking also. So in a make-to-order contract, the supplier, obviously because the risk is on them, they're going to try to reduce overstocking as much as possible. We talk about salvage costs, and as you guys have probably realized, salvage costs, you don't make as much money when you salvage your goods, when you sell it through an outlet store or whatever. So the supplier is going to try to limit their losses, or they won't limit their losses. They won't essentially lose money, but they're going to limit they will try to maximize their profitability. And sometimes salvage costs are less than the manufacturing costs. This happened in the 90s to the big three automakers. What happened is they did this massive automation swing and this big, they retooled a lot of factories to increase their capacity. But unfortunately, the break-even points were such that they had to build so many cars to break even. Well, the demand suddenly crashed in the 90s for cars due to various reasons. The main reasons was the entry of additional manufacturers. So the big three automakers, especially GM really got hurt by this, ended up making too many cars because they had to maintain a certain level of productivity in their factories to pay for the additional capacity that they have. So suddenly they had all these cars and they couldn't get rid of them. So at the end of the day, they started to give all these outrageous incentives to basically sell cars. And like I mentioned previously, when you provide a rebate or an incentive to a consumer, you're not you're not always creating a new demand. You may be also shifting a demand. So people who may have bought a car 6 months from now suddenly bought a car now, but GM viewed that as, oh, this is new demand. So their forecasting thought that that person was also going to buy a car 6 months from now. So it was kind of a snowball effect where they started to sell cars for less than it cost to build them, and they were foreseeing that the demand was going to maintain the previous level, but the demand actually crashed on the back end. So in that example, the salvage costs were lower than the cost to make the item. But in a lot of cases, the salvage costs are usually a little bit higher. In the examples in the book, you're going to see where the salvage costs are a little bit higher than the manufacturing costs. But just note that that's not always the case. We covered the Campbell soup example. That was another example where that occurred. But the big three really got hurt with that. So that makes to order contracts.
Can I comment here?
Of course.
So when you talk about the big three and GM having so many different divisions, from Chevy to GMC to Pontiac to Buick and Oldsmobile, it's actually a different scenario, I think, from a business perspective, because they were, I guess, categorizing their markets based on the profiles of the buyers. You know, your father's Oldsmobile, your Pontiac, and just different marketing toward different consumers. And I think what happened to GM was that they had too many options using too many similar components. And I think that contributed to the balance of demand.
Correct.
For building the right cars for the right people.
You're absolutely correct. That was one of the I tend to not try to go into marketing that much in this class because I love marketing. But like there's no saying, if you ask a marketer to solve a problem, you get a marketing answer. So,
right.
But you were absolutely correct, though. That would happen, and as a matter of fact, the case study that I read was what also happened because GM and Pontiac, you had Pontiac and Oldsmobile, everybody else, because they were in silos, they were actually competing against each other. They weren't
it's just capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. So all of a sudden, Pontiac would say, "Yeah, we got more sales this month," and Oldsmobile would be like, "Well, we lost sales." They didn't realize until it was too late that actually Pontiac was taking Oldsmobile sales. So Oldsmobile would react by creating a car that was one of Pontiac's best selling cars to go into Pontiac's market, and then they began to cannibalize their own markets. You're absolutely correct. But from a supply chain standpoint, they basically were, GM as a whole was building more cars than they could effectively sell, and then the whole demand they started to when we deal with the demand-based problems, I guess put on solving the viewing with this with a supply chain mind. Basically, their demand forecasting was started to become very wrong, and their break-even points for profitability because of all this investment was so high that they couldn't sell enough at the price they needed to maintain their profitability. But from a marketing standpoint, you're absolutely correct, and I couldn't have said it better than you did.
And one of the reasons they bring it up, and I'm glad that Dawn is on the phone because we're on the same team, and we chose Toyota. And a couple of weeks ago, you commented on a company who will have higher end vehicles selling into different markets versus lower end vehicles, and there is kind of that crossover point of where does a Toyota buyer become a Lexus buyer?
You're right. And
right?
that's sure, you're absolutely correct. And from a supply chain standpoint, that's a very hard question
Hmm.
because in most cases, marketing determines that. And like I mentioned, I think a couple weeks ago, when Mercedes, I think it was Mercedes, it was a European auto.
Introduce the C class.
Yes, well, they said, "Hey, we're going to go into the economy car class." And they said, "Great!" And all of a sudden,
I
like,
told Don this might resonate to Don. That's why I say it's apropos, because Don, I don't know if you remember one of my posts. I said I was a little bit of a car guy.
Yeah, I got that.
So,
I do.
all right,
I
I
did
might
read
be
that,
going.
yes, I did.
Yeah. So, just trying to put things in perspective. And
yeah,
since it's just the three of us, I thought we might have a little bit of time for
yeah.
commentary.
Oh no, you're fine. And that's fine because I almost went into this big post for branding and all these different things. And I said, okay, Ken, this is a supply chain class, not a marketing class. You're going to start, overwhelming these people with like marketing concepts because I've got a master's in marketing. I've never really used it, but I love marketing as a science because it really dives into human behavior. And
Hmm.
my PhD deals mostly with human behavior in groups. So I find it fascinating. But so I tend to have a tendency of going, oh wow, this is really cool stuff. Let me share it with the class. I'm going, okay, Ken, hold on a minute, dude. Let's not. You're gonna make heads roll if you try to throw too many marketing terms at them. So, but you're right. It's the concept of brand is very very interesting, and the way that products compete on several different of those curves that I shared is
Hmm.
fascinating. And if you read one of those curves wrong, you end up damaging your brand or like diluting your brand. Just depends. Um, and and Toyota, when they had all the problems, I actually did a paper on this for my PhD thesis. But Toyota actually tried to shift into the their high quality meant that they spent longer in the design phase and they spent a little bit more time doing certain things to improve the quality. Well, they decided that they were going to become they were going to move into a mass production type strategy. So they began to do things to reduce the lead time in the design phase. And a lot of these things were picked up in the manufacturing design phase. Like, hey, look, you've got some serious safety issues in these vehicles, but because senior management was saying, hey, and they got caught into something similar to what the big three did. Hey, we're trying to overtake GM as the largest manufacturer in the world. Their senior management basically squashed a lot of these reports coming from, Toyota's famous for bottom up communication. Well, they began to squash that. So Toyota started to become a mass production company, and they began to shift their brand inadvertently away from their niche, and it ended up costing them severely. So then that's when the old executive had to retire, and the new executive had to retire. He was like the younger person in the Toyota family, and the senior man who gave the reins to his son or grandson basically came in and said, "Hey, sorry, we screwed up, but I'm going to fix it." And that's when Toyota went on this big, massive quality kick, and they didn't do
Hmm.
it because they were socially obligated. That's part of it. If you understand Japanese culture, it's part of it. But a big part of it was like, hey, our brand relies on us retaining and going back to this brand, value proposition that we kind of threw in the garbage. So Toyota really had no choice, because what they also began to realize was that people began to relate Lexus with Toyota's problems. As I said, well, if Toyota had these problems, what about Lexus? So Toyota's like going, whoa, we got to stop this right now. So that's when they went into this big quality kick and kind of went back to basics. We are definitely
And they were
going.
getting huge pressure from Honda as well,
Oh,
who has been a long time quality.
yeah.
Again, I don't want to go down a rat hole here, but
No, but you're absolutely
it's
correct. Absolutely
it's
correct.
valuable.
And then, of course, Kia and Hyundai, who for a long time were low quality, mass production, cheap car manufacturers, suddenly 1 year of one of the Hyundai cars had the highest quality in the market. And it's like, people going, what, a Hyundai? Like, wow, this is amazing. How did this happen? Well, it happened because Toyota said, we're going to lose the quality. We're going to leave the quality market and go into mass production, multiple unit production. I don't know if Hyundai still has that mantle. I think Toyota took it back from, but that's a Consumer Reports thing. But so that's very, very fascinating. Okay, so back to the supply chain world.
All right, sorry.
No. As I said, I love marketing stuff. I just try not to overwhelm the students with marketing stuff. But it's a great conversation, though. Okay, make the stock. Now we're going to look at supplier. Basically, in a make to stock contract, the supplier builds units in advance to meet supply. So the buyer will still order product based upon a demand forecast, but now the supplier builds units in advance. So a buyer says, "Hey, look," and Walmart does this. We are only going to order 900 units, but we want you to build. Well, sometimes they'll make the supplier build a certain amount of safety stock. But in this example, the supplier builds. This is the supplier side of the contract, where the supplier will build units in advance to meet supply. So the buyer will say, "Okay, we will order 900 units, but we want to always have 1,000 units available." Walmart does this. Other ones do too, and this is where the supplier has all the power in the supply chain. They say, "Hey, not only are we going to order so much, but we also will have you contractually obligated to have so much in the supply chain." Okay. So in this example, obviously the supplier assumes all the risk from overstocking as before, and but now the buyer's profitability is limited due to the risk of shortages. So because the supplier has to pay salvage costs for excess stock. Let me look at something real quick. Did I? Yeah. Okay. So now the risk is now swapped. Okay. Previously, the supplier their profitability is limited due to overstocking. But now what happens is the buyer's profitability is limited due to risk of shortages, because now basically the supplier is still going to make only enough to meet the supply. If the buyer, and sometimes it's not a big deal, but if the buyer expects a large demand, and let's say they need 1,100 instead of 1,000, the supplier is going to say, "Hey, look, I'm not going to build 1,100 because you're not going to guarantee me that you're going to buy those extra units." So the supplier is only going to build 1,000. So there are times when the buyer is going to say, "Look, I know we contractually said 1,000, but we may want more. We have the ability to maybe sell 1,200. So we need to find a mechanism to encourage the supplier to build more than they were contractually obligated to build."
So why in this scenario wouldn't the risk be on the buyer side? If it's a make to stock for their inventory to sell through, the supplier is going to commit to what the demand from the buyer is.
Yeah.
Doesn't that put the buyer?
There is some risk from the buyer of not having enough stock. But the supplier, okay, like let's say that in the contract, they say, "Okay, we need you to have 1,000 units on hand at all times," and the buyer only buys 900. If the buyer only buys 900, let's say they don't pull the extra 100 from stock, the supplier is going to pay to get rid of that extra stock. Okay.
I get that. I understand that.
Maybe the verbiage
that logic
is not
at it
very clear.
from the
That's
other
actually,
side.
yeah, that's actually why I kind of had to go back to slide 4, because I might work on the slides a little bit. I might make them more clear. But yeah, so and the buyer, they have a profitability risk. Previously, the supplier had a profitability risk because they may want to incentivize the buyer to buy more of their product for whatever reasons. Usually it's break-even point. Or they may have, like if a manufacturer has 4 or 5 companies that they provide products to, maybe, when we do the aggregation of demand, one of their customers may have had a bad time this period, so they may have extra stock from that one of their buyers didn't buy. So now they got this extra stock from another part of their supply chain that they want to shift to another buyer. So sometimes they'll want it. So in that scenario, the supplier has a lot of risk. Well, this is just swapping it over now.
Well, and that goes back to, it goes back to the supply and demand from an economic standpoint and the equilibrium point that we talked about a couple of weeks ago.
Sure.
You may not have a shift in the supply or demand curve, but you could have a change in the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, which doesn't change the curve, and you still have the same equilibrium point. However, like you're talking about, it does put the onus back on the supplier and the buyer.
Sure. No,
demand.
You're right. And there's a systems, I think I talked about it a couple weeks ago, there's a systems theory. It's kind of like a race to the bottom, where the more rare something becomes, the higher the consumption for that item becomes. And this occurs, I listened to a really cool paper a couple years ago by some researchers at Texas A&M that actually studied sheep grazing patterns, and they found that when there's less grazing area for the sheep to graze, they actually eat more grass. It's weird, when they perceive when they perceive that there's less grass go around, they eat more because they want to hoard their part of this scarce product. Same with like oil. Whenever there's a shortage in the oil market, the oil companies will buy more because they want to hoard it to make sure that they can protect their inventories.
So I guess sheep are smarter than we think.
Yeah, at least when it comes to eating, anyway. Yeah, exactly. I've seen things from sheep that makes me question that, but you're absolutely right. Or at least they act like, humans act like sheep, I guess. We could say that. So does that make sense? And to make the stock, the supplier has a risk of overstocking if the buyer doesn't pull the additional product, which is a difference from what they buy to what the supplier is contractually obligated to build. And the buyer profitability is limited in the event of demand being higher than what the supplier is contractually obligated to keep in the supply chain system. That makes sense.
And like you said at the onset, it all begins with the contracts that we started talking about in the past couple of weeks. Who has the risk, who's got the responsibility, and the incentives.
Sure.
And such.
And in my experience, 90 to 95% of the contracts are, hey, we're going to build a new product and we're going to make a very basic contract. And they start this sequential supply chain relationship where each of them is incentivized to reduce their own risk. So the buyer only buys as much as they will sell, and the supplier will only build as much as they can as the buyer buys. And all of a sudden, if the product becomes popular, the buyer goes, hey, we need more product. And the supplier says, okay, fine, just buy it. And the buyer's like, well, I don't want to assume that risk. What if I can't sell? And the supplier's like, say, that's not my problem. That's your problem. And I've seen that a lot. So obviously these kinds of contracts sub-optimizes the performance of the supply chain. And in my last class, this was kind of we spent a whole video conference talking about this because they couldn't understand why anyone would want to create incentives, because why wouldn't a supplier only build what is bought, and why wouldn't a buyer only buy what's in the demand forecast? Why would so they were thinking, why shouldn't we allow each person to maximize their own profitability? And the reason is because sometimes to optimize the supply chain's capabilities, sometimes you have to share the risk amongst all the actors in the supply chain so that overall profitability increases. Now, that's not to say that, as you're going to see in next week's examples, you may still have excess stock. You may still have shortages, but sometimes you could create an incentive where the supplier can still have excess stock and salvage costs and still make more money, and vice versa. You still make an incentive where the buyer may buy more than they can sell, but still make more money than if they just stuck to their demand forecast. And we're going to go through yeah.
So does that speak to elasticity, planned obsolescence, and life cycle of a product, like we talked about with Apple?
It can, sure. Those are three areas where you may factor in incentives. Like, for instance, let's say Apple's going to come out with a new, and as a matter of fact, I do this a lot here in the Middle East. It's kind of funny, but what happens, like right before the new iPads come out, the market here in Dubai gets flooded with the previous year's models of iPads, and you can buy them for half of what the new ones cost.
Right.
So Apple may go, hey, look, we made more money because we were able to sell more than we had originally forecasted. But although we had purchased more, we still made more money by selling more than we expected, even though we still have to pay salvage costs of so much. Now, usually this assumes that the salvage cost is more than the manufacturing price. I guess in theory it doesn't have to be, but obviously your profitability would erode if you start to sell things for more than you paid to have them made, or more than you paid for them. But there's something that's hard for people to understand. You can still have an increased profit and still have overstock.
Could that be related to the planned purchase price of the components for a finished good product, where the cost goes down toward the end of the life cycle of the product, even though you're making either the same or more?
No, you're
reduction in.
Yes.
Yeah, with the reduction in the component cost, that's where the profit is going to kind of an inverse relationship.
No, you're right. I don't know if I talked about this yet, but there's a theory of constraints strategy. I'm going to go over theory of constraints, I think like week 9 or week 10. Just really, it's short, but theory of constraints is a really cool strategy for supply chains. And one of the strategies is hey, let's say your break-even point is 1,000 units. And the break-even point is calculated based upon fixed costs plus the variable cost per unit. Okay, and you divide that into the number of units that are required to achieve that much money. Okay, basically what you do is you basically how many units does it take for our profitability to meet our fixed costs in general. Okay. Now let's say your break-even point's 1,000 units. Now after 1,000 units, let's say your fixed cost is $5 and your variable cost is $1. If you sell something for $10, Actually, I think I talked about this when I talked about supersizing and rebates. So let's say your break-even point
You did, yeah.
is 1,000 units. Well, now your cost per unit for unit 1,001 is only $1. So now you can say, hey, buddy, I'm going to sell you this $10 product for $5. You still make $4 a profit. You may not make $9 a profit, but you still make $4 a profit. So a popular strategy for theory of constraints is that once you reach your break-even point where you've basically covered all your fixed costs, you can make these kinds of great deals. Say, hey, look, one time only, we're going to let you buy products for half price. And they go, oh, cool, yay, I can get stuff for half price. And they buy a whole bunch. Now, obviously, there's a risk that you saturate the product such that you shift your demand. So you create these oscillations in your demand. But this is they usually recommend that you do this when you want to enter new markets. Like, let's say you have a product that you want to go into the European market, and you're not there yet. And you say, hey, European distributor, we're going to give you these products for half price so that you can introduce our products. Now, note that next month we have to charge you full, but this is like an introductory offer. Okay. They usually don't recommend doing this in the same market that you sell your stuff for full price. They instead like to recommend everyday. Yeah, exactly. They say, everyday low prices. Walmart's really good about this. They'll say, hey, look, this is the everyday low price. We don't have a lot of sales, because they've realized that when you have a lot of sales, you begin to artificially inflate your demand. And that makes your demand forecasting, that injects variation into your demand curve. I've talked about this a few times going on. Does this make sense, Don? Did Dawn fall asleep?
I don't know. Hopefully we didn't lose her.
I have that effect on people sometimes.
Oh no, I'm here.
Okay.
I think I'm the one that's taking people fall asleep. We're only on slide 5 or 6, and we've got 13 to go through. So I'll stop asking questions at this point.
No. I mean, I'm learning from you guys, so it's fine.
The last 5 of them are actually pretty quick. So now, incentives. Like I mentioned before, incentives are used to increase profitability of the entire supply chain. Sometimes you want to share the risk between all the parties so that the supplier is incentivized to produce more, and the buyer is incentivized to buy more. And as I said, sometimes you may have excess product, but the profitability is still higher. It may not be optimized, because optimized basically means that you've maximized your profitability, but you will make more profit than if you just stuck to a suboptimal scenario. So there's 4 main types that they talk about in the book. So we've got buyback contracts, revenue sharing, quantity flexibility, and sales rebates. There's a lot of them in there, actually. There's quite a few, but these are the main big ones. Because one of the assignments, and this is a very difficult assignment, I think it's like week 7. It's a very complicated assignment where you're going to basically calculate all this stuff, and then they're going to say, okay, create an incentive. How would you incentivize this, and calculate how this incentive would change the profitability? There's a lot of math involved. So be forewarned. I think it's week 7 where you're going to have a lot of work going on. So, and I may have a special video conference for that one, because that one students traditionally have a lot of problems with. But so incentives, buyback contracts. It's very simple. The supplier offers to pay the buyer for unsold units. So the supplier may say, hey, look, in the previous scenario where the buyer buys 900, but the supplier wants them to buy 1,000, then they'll say, hey, look, buy 1,000, and for any ones that you do not sell, we will buy them back from you for a certain cost above salvage cost. So let's say that the salvage cost is $10. They'll say, look, for any products that you cannot sell up to 1,000, we will pay you $11 for each one. So now, and what you're going to find out with these calculations is you basically shift profit from the supplier to the buyer up to that 900 point. Now, obviously, if the buyer is able to sell all 1,000, everyone makes a lot of money. But what you do is just say, hey, look, if you're not able to sell everything that you buy from us, we will shift some of our profit to you to offset some of your risk. And so when this happens, the buyer is incentivized to buy more units. So because their profitability model basically will shift a little bit so that now they may be able to, ideally, if it's calculated correctly, the incentive will be up to 1,000 units. In a real world, it rarely gets to the full, to the full point, because obviously the manufacturer starts to lose profitability and they begin to assume more and more risk. So there's a point where the manufacturer is not going to be willing to have that much risk to the profitability. Although in a theory of constraint strategy, if they're at that point where the fixed costs are absorbed, they may do something like this because, okay, fine. If the salvage cost is, say, $1.50, and we're at $1, we're not going to lose much profitability. So this is a way for the manufacturer to help shift some of the burden. So and this is typically used in make-to-order contracts. You could use this in a make-to-stock contract. It's theoretically possible. I haven't seen it that much in make-to-stock contracts. Now, to be fair, I haven't seen this a lot, but I guess theoretically it is possible. So revenue sharing contract is the opposite. The buyer shares revenue with the supplier in exchange for a discount. So the buyer, let's say in the previous example, the buyer expects demand to go up to 1,200. They'll say, hey, look, supplier, build 1,200, go above the 1,000 that you're contractually obligated, go up to 1,200. And in exchange for you to go up to 1,200, we will give you extra, we will pay you more for each product. Okay. Or what they'll also say, in this regard, they'll go, we want to go up to 1,200. Give us, charge us less money per unit on these extra 200 so that we could provide an incentive for people to buy this product. And in exchange, we will share the revenue for any product above the 900 that we're obligated to buy. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now, once again, like I mentioned before, when you do this, you have a chance of artificially inflating your demand and shifting your demand. Because what I've usually seen with this is, let's say your demand, you sell all 200. Well, actually all 300. You went from 900 to 1,200. Well, what part of that 300 are new customers? What part of those 300 are customers that bought early? It's hard to tell. It takes time for you to get enough demand forecasting in to be able to understand the new demand shift. But unfortunately, a lot of these decisions are made inside that scope. So it's not too uncommon to see this type of incentive result in erroneous demand forecasting going forward. It takes time to adjust.
But to that point, based on technology today, and I'm going to throw my technology hat on, and business intelligence, BI, and big data. So when you start analyzing, okay, who's a net new customer versus who is a current or even an upsell customer, that's where you can ascertain that type of demand. If a company has those types of capabilities with the systems that they have through CRM
Sure. And a lot of the benefits of CRM, it's able to do this not because it can read the mind of the consumer, but because the data is so instantaneous that they could detect these demand changes. And with certain algorithms, they can say, okay, based upon how demand changed since we did X, we have Y number of new customers, because these CRM algorithm models have that built into it. But once again, as I always say, models are only as good as constraints that are designed into them. The CRM models are actually very good nowadays. They're not perfect, but yeah, you're right though. The business intelligence has gotten much better, but I have seen many instances where there's too much reliance on the data. Like case in point, when the market crashed, the market crashed because all these buy and sell algorithms basically said to buy and sell at the same time. Now, is the CRM systems that are used by VMIs better than the old-fashioned way? Oh, of course, much better. All I'm saying is that human behavior is a little bit more random sometimes, and the models can portray. But for, like you said, like 99% of the time, yeah, these models are pretty accurate. Okay. Now, quantity flexibility contracts. This may not be in the textbook, but basically, the supplier provides a full refund for unsold products up to a certain refund level. Okay. So the overstock costs are shifted to the supplier. So they say, look, we're going to build 1,200. You will buy 1,200, but we will provide a refund for any products up to 900 that you purchase. So go ahead and buy 1,200. And if you sell 1,100, great. We'll buy back that 100. Okay. If you only sell 900, we'll buy back those 300, at the cost that you paid for the products from us. So what this does is it's very effective for shifting the risk from the buyer to the supplier up to the refund level. Okay, so this encourages the buyer to encourage purchases to this encourages buyers to purchase units up to whatever the refund level is. So up to 1,200 units, we will refund you whatever you don't sell. Okay. Obviously, this is a very risky proposition for manufacturers, so they obviously don't do this very often. But it's something that they can do if they foresee. Or they may do this anyway if they're in that area of constraints area where they've met all their fixed costs. They may say, hey, look, yeah, we have a new buyer. We can offer this because our risk is very low to begin with. So
and they could have secondary markets that they could sell them to without going down to salvage costs.
Sure, and sometimes like in this example, if the salvage cost is more than in the example where the variable cost per unit is $1 and they're selling it for 10, as long as the salvage cost is over $1, they're still making money.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, you want to sell those in different markets. You don't dilute, because if you start to salvage these items in the same market as your buyers, they're going to get a little pissed off at you.
Of course.
But you understand the basic concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So, now sales rebate, and this is the last. I think this last one that I cover maybe. Oh, okay, yeah, this is sales rebate. Basically, it provides a rebate to retailer for any unit sold over a certain quantity. This is the general rebate strategy. So the supplier says, "Hey, look, we have a whole bunch. If you can, for any units sold over a certain amount, we'll provide a rebate." And you know how the rebates work. We had a very lengthy discussion in the discussion questions about how rebates work. And yeah, and this is a way for a company to mitigate risk by basically, it's kind of like a shell game. Like you said, we're going to offer rebates to increase demand. If the customer takes advantage of the rebate, fine, we still make money. If the customer buys a product and doesn't take advantage of the rebate, we make more money. And this is, like it says here, typically used by the supplier to sell overstocked units. So this is when the supplier goes, wow, we got a lot of stuff here. We're going to go to all our buyers. And this is where the distributors come in. They say, hey, look, we got other, manufacturers with a lot of product. They may see one of their buyers just begging for stock because they may be in an area where there's a high demand. They'll say, hey, look, we're going to offer a rebate to you because the manufacturer is offering a rebate to us to get rid of products. So that's the way to shift to shift the risk over from a manufacturer who may not have access to a certain market to a new buyer. So this is pretty direct. We've talked about rebates at length. So these are 4 incentives. I think there's quite a few in the textbook, but these are the main ones. Any questions? I'm assuming.
I don't have any.
Awesome.
I'm
All
good.
right. Don's still awake. I'm so happy to hear that.
I am.
Okay, good. Okay, so distributor roles. In classes, I frequently say, if Walmart's able to shrink the supply chain, why have a distributor? And that's a very valid point. The role of a distributor used to be to kind of link buyers with sellers. You still see a lot of distributors in Japan, but they're a different story because Japan's a smaller country, and because you have a lot of manufacturers, and the buyers or the retailers are very close geographically. A distributor has a much different role in Japan because they provide variety. And they also provide, I think I've talked about this before, but they also provide a means to dampen risk. An example that I use is when the tsunami hit Japan, Toyota was able to mitigate a lot of the lost manufacturing capability because they went to their distributors and said, hey, look, we need to build. I'm just going to give you an example. This isn't a true number, but let's say we need to build 10,000 cars, but we just lost 9,000 of these parts for these cars. Distributors, what can you do for us? And the distributors, because distributors in Japan are incentivized to have many manufacturers, and Toyota incentivizes them to have many manufacturers for the same part. The distributors were essential in Toyota's example by providing extra suppliers for parts. That's very possible in Japan because everything's very close. In America, because it's a lot more spread out, that kind of role is different. So what a distributors in America, based upon what I've seen from research and from my discussions with those folks from Texas, what they do is something similar to what the Japanese do. They expand their network. They're kind of like a network enhancer for both the buyer and the supplier. So let's say Walmart wants to go into a certain type of product that they may not have now. They go to a distributor and say, hey, look, what do you have for us? And then the distributor can say, look, we have this portfolio of products that we can help you get these products. And in short term, they may help Walmart with the distribution. For the Walmart may eventually, once they identify these folks. Now, this is just an example. I'm not sure if Walmart does this, but this is just an example. But if say Walmart went to a distributor and they find these people, that's Walmart may go directly to these people to make a long-term contract, but they use a distributor to help identify extra sources. Or let's say if a tsunami wipes out the Gulf of Mexico, which I don't know if that's possible, but let's say it does, and all of a sudden something that's produced for Walmart gets wiped out. A distributor allows Walmart to mitigate those losses by going to extra resources. Okay, and also on the flip side, distributors build a portfolio of buyers. So what they do is kind of like when I talk about the theory of postponement, where you try to move the flexibility of your supply chain as far up as possible by modularizing things to the point of where you reduce variation on one end, but you increase the variety on the other end. I'm going to talk more about this when we talk about push-pull supply chains. We're going to talk about Dell's push-pull supply chain in a couple weeks, and I'll go into that more. Those theories, the system theories behind that in more detail. But what this allows, distributors allow both manufacturers and suppliers to increase the variety of products in their supply chain, which true increases the variation of products, but also allows them to absorb more variation. Like let's say if you have customers that suddenly, and this I'm going to talk about my wife who was pregnant and started craving watermelon in December. If your supply chain doesn't have the flexibility to give you watermelons in December, and you suddenly see this sudden demand for watermelons in December, well, a distributor can say, look, we have this large variety of suppliers. We have people who can give you watermelons in December. So they use the variety from one end to absorb the variation on another end. Okay, and that's Ashby's first law of systems, where you use only variety can absorb variation. So does that make sense?
Yes, to me it does.
Okay.
Yes,
So
sir.
I just put this in there because sometimes students say, well, why have a distributor at all? And if you view them in a conventional manner, you're right. There's no need for them. Because of technology, the old rule of a person who just moves goods back and forth is gone, really. Or it's not as important anymore. Now, so distributors are actually addressing that by changing how they do their job. So,
well, and that talks to what we addressed a couple of weeks ago about value-added resellers.
yes.
Because,
Yeah.
as you and I have discussed, working for HP and Dell, there's a difference between direct, indirect, box to dock. Like you just said, selling through. If you're not adding value, then a customer doesn't want to pay the whatever number of points on top of the buying price from the manufacturer if they're not doing anything additional than just providing shipment.
Yeah, you're right. And it's amazing how people have problems seeing that sometimes, because they get caught in the distributor gets caught in their distributor mindset. They don't understand how the supply chain guy thinks, how the marketing guy thinks. They're solving supply chain problems using a distributor mindset. So okay, well, that is all I had. Slide 13 is I just had this here to solve the week 6 problem. And I'll go through that on next Thursday. So
Yeah, I'd rather not see that until I do week 5.
yeah.
I hear you, Don. I'm going to be spending the next couple of days diving into 5.5.
Yeah, me too.
Doing that
I'm
math.
on information overload already.
Yeah. So let's just plan on Sunday at
Okay.
noon, which is 9 p.m. my time.
Okay.
I will just have a video con to go over 5.5. And I'll do the same as last week. I'll just make a sample problem. I'll
Okay.
go over the sample problem. I'll answer it. It won't be 100% the same as what you guys are saying, but it'll be very, very close. And then if you guys feel that you guys need extra time to do this, I don't mind extending it to Tuesday like I did last time.
Okay.
That's not